The pre-dawn darkness of May the 1st, 1898, hung thick over Manila Bay like a shroud waiting to be torn asunder. Commodore George Dewey stood rigid on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he peered through the gloom toward the Spanish fleet anchored in Cavite Harbor. Behind him, 6 American warships cut through the placid waters in perfect formation, still leviathans. That would soon rewrite the destiny of 2 empires in a single morning's work. The tension aboard the American squadron was palpable. Sailors checked and rechecked their weapons, their faces etched with a peculiar mixture of fear and anticipation that precedes battle. Many had never seen combat. Few could have imagined they were about to participate in one of the most decisive naval engagements in modern history. The Spanish-American War had erupted just weeks earlier, sparked by the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, but already the conflict was spreading across oceans. Dewey had received his orders from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt himself: proceed to the Philippines and destroy the Spanish Pacific Squadron. It was a command that would either catapult the United States onto the world stage as a global power or send American sailors to watery graves in foreign waters. The Commodore understood the weight of the moment. This was not merely a battle for strategic advantage, but a test of American naval supremacy against a centuries-old European maritime power. As the first pale fingers of dawn began to illuminate the horizon, the American fleet advanced toward Cavite Peninsula. The USS Olympia led the column, followed by the USS Baltimore, USS Raleigh, USS Petrel, USS Concord, and USS Boston. Each vessel represented the pinnacle of late 19th century naval engineering, armed with rapid-fire guns and protected by steel armor that gleamed dully in the morning light. The Spanish squadron, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoyo y Pasarin, consisted of 7 vessels of varying conditions and capabilities. The flagship Reina Cristina, though bearing a proud name, was an aging cruiser that had seen better days. The Don Juan de Austria, Castilla, Don Antonio de Ulloa, Isla de Luzon, Isla de Cuba, and Marques del Duro completed the Spanish line. Many of these ships were antiquated, their wooden hulls and outdated armament no match for the modern American steel warships bearing down upon them. Montoyo had chosen his position carefully, anchoring his fleet in the shallow waters near Cavite where damaged vessels might be beached, rather than sunk completely. The Spanish commander knew his situation was desperate. His ships were outgunned, his crews inexperienced, and his supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Yet honor and duty demanded he make a stand, even against overwhelming odds. The silence of the bay was broken only by the rhythmic churning of engines and the gentle lapping of waves against steel hulls. Both fleets prepared for what would become one of the most lopsided naval victories in military history, though none could predict the swiftness and totality of what was about to unfold. At precisely 5:35 in the morning, as the Spanish batteries at Cavite opened fire, Commodore Dewey turned to his flag captain, Charles Vernon Gridley, and uttered the words that would echo through American naval history: "You may fire when ready." Gridley, the USS Olympia's 8-inch guns roared to life, sending shells screaming across the water toward the Spanish line, and the Battle of Manila Bay began in earnest. The American squadron advanced in a long oval pattern, passing before the Spanish fleet while delivering devastating broadsides. The superior training of American gunners became immediately apparent, as their shells found their marks with deadly precision, while Spanish return fire fell harmlessly into the water or whistled overhead. The modern fire control systems aboard the American vessels allowed for coordinated, accurate gunnery that the Spanish fleet simply could not match. Admiral Montoyo's flagship, the Reina Cristina, bore the brunt of the initial American assault. Within minutes of the engagement's opening, the aging Spanish cruiser was riddled with holes, her superstructure ablaze, and her crew falling at their posts. The Don Juan de Austria fared little better, taking hit after hit from the American guns as smoke and flame began to obscure the Spanish line. According to naval historian Admiral William Soden Sims' comprehensive account, in the victory at sea, the American gunnery demonstrated a level of precision that shocked contemporary naval observers. Worldwide, the USS Baltimore and USS Boston concentrated their fire on the Spanish shore batteries, systematically silencing the coastal defenses that might have posed a threat to Dewey's squadron. The rapid-fire guns of the smaller American cruisers shattered continuously, their shells creating a deadly hail of steel that swept the Spanish decks clean of any man brave enough to remain at his post. As the American column completed its first pass, the extent of Spanish devastation became clear. The Reina Cristina was listing heavily, her captain mortally wounded and her crew struggling to keep the vessel afloat. The wooden gunboat Don Antonio de Ulloa had been reduced to splinters, her proud colors still flying even as she settled into the shallow waters of the bay. Dewey ordered his squadron to withdraw, temporarily, concerned about ammunition expenditure, a pause that would later become controversial when it was discovered that American casualties were virtually non-existent and ammunition supplies remained adequate. During this brief respite, the Spanish fleet attempted to regroup, but their situation had become hopeless. Several vessels were already sinking, others were so badly damaged they could barely maneuver, and the morale of Spanish crews had been shattered by the ferocity and accuracy of American gunnery. The Costilla, an unprotected cruiser that had been converted from a merchant vessel, attempted to maintain her position in the line despite taking numerous hits. Her crew's courage was undeniable, but courage alone could not compensate for inferior equipment and obsolete tactics. The Spanish strategy of fighting at anchor while protecting their vessels from complete loss had left them sitting targets for American gunners, who had trained extensively in long-range accuracy. When the American squadron resumed its attack, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The methodical destruction of the Spanish fleet continued with mechanical precision, each pass of the American column bringing fresh devastation to Montoya's remaining vessels. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating a bay filled with smoke, debris, and the remnants of Spanish naval power in the Pacific. The resumption of combat brought with it a systematic annihilation that would be studied in naval academies for generations to come. As Dewey's squadron began its second series of passes, the Spanish fleet's desperate situation became a rout of epic proportions. The USS Olympia's guns continued their deadly work, each salvo finding its mark among the increasingly helpless Spanish vessels. The Reina Cristina, Admiral Montoya's proud flagship, made one final, heroic attempt to close with the American line. Through the smoke and flame that wreathed her damaged superstructure, the Spanish cruiser began a desperate charge toward the USS Olympia, her remaining guns blazing in defiance. It was a gesture of magnificent futility, that kind of gallant last stand that epitomizes naval tradition even in the face of certain doom. American gunners responded to this final Spanish offensive with devastating effectiveness. Shell after shell crashed into the Reina Cristina's hull, opening massive holes below her waterline and setting fires throughout her length. Her forward turret was blown completely away, taking dozens of brave Spanish sailors with it. Within minutes of beginning her charge, the flagship was forced to limp back toward shore, her attack having accomplished nothing save to demonstrate Spanish courage. In the face of impossible odds, the smallest Spanish vessels fared even worse under the renewed American assault. The Don Antonio de Ulloa, already heavily damaged from the first phase of fighting, finally succumbed to American fire and settled into the shallow waters near Cavite, with her colors still defiantly flying. Meanwhile, the shore batteries at Cavite continued their futile resistance, their obsolete guns unable to reach the American squadron as it maneuvered beyond effective range. The USS Boston and USS Petrel had effectively silenced most of the Spanish coastal artillery during their first pass, leaving only scattered guns to contest the American advance. These remaining batteries served more as symbols of Spanish determination than as effective military obstacles. The USS Concord and USS Petrel, the smallest vessels in Dewey's squadron, were ordered to close with the Spanish line and finish off any vessels still showing signs of resistance. Their latter draft allowed them to operate in the shallow waters, where Spanish ships had sought refuge, and their rapid-fire guns proved devastatingly effective against the thin-skinned enemy vessels. As the morning progressed, the bay began to fill with the debris of naval warfare, floating timber, personal effects, and the tragic human cost of military conflict. Spanish survivors clung to wreckage or swam desperately toward shore, while their comrades continued to man their guns aboard vessels that were clearly doomed. The courage of individual Spanish sailors could not be questioned, even by their American opponents, who watched the destruction with professional admiration for their enemy's bravery. The Marques del Douro, one of the last Spanish vessels still capable of resistance, attempted to escape toward the open sea, but was quickly overtaken by the faster American cruisers. Her fate was sealed when shells from the USS Baltimore destroyed her engine room, leaving her dead in the water and vulnerable to the systematic fire that had claimed her sister ships throughout the morning. Even as their fleet disintegrated around them, Spanish officers and sailors continued to display the kind of heroic devotion to duty that naval historians would later celebrate as the finest tradition of maritime warfare. Captain Luis Cadarso of the Reina Cristina, mortally wounded early in the engagement, refused to leave his bridge until a direct hit finally silenced his vessel's guns forever. His last order was to ensure the ship's colors remained flying, a testament to Spanish honor even in the face of crushing defeat. The Don Juan de Austria, her hull perforated by countless American shells, continued to return fire with her remaining guns until the very moment she settled into the shallow waters of Cavite Harbor. Her crew had suffered enormous casualties, yet those who remained at their posts maintained discipline and continued their duties until physically prevented from doing so by the sinking of their vessel. Admiral Montoyo, realizing that further resistance would serve only to increase the slaughter of his men without achieving any military purpose, ordered his flag transferred to the small gunboat Isla de Cuba. This vessel, barely more than an armed transport, had somehow survived the initial phases of the battle despite being completely outclassed by every ship in the American squadron. From this humble command post, the Spanish admiral continued to coordinate what remained of his fleet's resistance. The shore installations at Cavite provided their own examples of Spanish courage under fire. Artillery crews continued to serve their guns long after it became clear that their weapons could not effectively engage the American squadron. These men knew they were fighting a losing battle, yet military honor demanded they maintain their positions until specifically ordered to withdraw, or until their guns were physically destroyed by enemy fire. The transport's crew, consisting largely of merchant sailors with minimal military training, nonetheless manned their inadequate weapons with determination that impressed even their American opponents. When the vessel finally surrendered, her deck was littered with casualties who had died defending a ship they knew could never withstand serious naval combat. Spanish engineering crews aboard the various vessels displayed particular heroism, remaining below decks to maintain steam and power even as shells crashed through their ships' hulls around them. These men knew that abandoning their posts would doom their vessels immediately, so they continued their work in the engine rooms and boiler spaces. While their ships literally disintegrated above them, many died at their posts, victims of flooding or explosion. But their sacrifice allowed their comrades above decks to continue fighting until the very end. The small gunboat Callao attempted to ram the USS Petrel in a desperate act of defiance, but her damaged engines could not generate sufficient speed to make the attack effective. American gunners easily avoided the Spanish vessel's charge and responded with concentrated fire. That quickly reduced her to a burning wreck. Yet the attempt itself demonstrated the fighting spirit that characterized Spanish resistance. Throughout the morning's engagement, as the sun climbed higher over Manila Bay, it illuminated a scene of maritime destruction unprecedented in modern naval warfare. The Spanish Pacific Squadron had been virtually annihilated, yet their sacrifice had been marked by countless individual acts of heroism that would be remembered long after the political consequences of their defeat had faded into history. By 10:30 in the morning, the Battle of Manila Bay had effectively ended, leaving behind a scene of devastation that shocked even the victorious Americans. The Spanish fleet lay in ruins. Throughout the shallow waters of Cavite Harbor, some vessels completely sunk, others beached and burning, all of them testimony to the destructive power of modern naval gunnery when wielded by well-trained crews against inferior opposition. The USS Olympia ceased fire as the last Spanish vessel struck her colors, and an eerie silence settled over the bay, broken only by the crackling of flames aboard wrecked ships and the cries of survivors in the water. Commodore Dewey ordered his squadron to lower boats immediately for rescue operations, demonstrating the humanitarian tradition of naval warfare that transcended national boundaries. American sailors, who had been trying to kill their opponents just moments before, now risked their own lives to save Spanish seamen from drowning. The casualty figures would later astound the world and establish the Battle of Manila Bay as one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. The Spanish fleet had suffered approximately 380 killed and wounded, with several vessels completely destroyed and others damaged beyond repair. The American squadron, by contrast, had sustained a total of 8 wounded, none killed, and no significant damage to any vessel. It was a disparity that spoke to the revolution in naval technology and training that had occurred during the late 19th century. Admiral Montoyo, his flag now flying from the small gunboat Isla de Cuba, surveyed the wreckage of his command with the stoic dignity expected of a professional naval officer. He had known from the beginning that his obsolete vessels could not match the modern American squadron, yet duty had required him to make the attempt. His tactical decision to fight at anchor in shallow water had saved many Spanish lives. by preventing his ships from sinking completely, allowing their crews to abandon them and reach safety ashore. The destruction of the Spanish shore batteries had been nearly as complete as that of their fleet. The fortress at Cavite, which had seemed so formidable to Spanish defenders, had been reduced to rubble by American naval gunfire. The heavy guns that were to have protected Manila Bay lay twisted and silent, their crews scattered or casualties. Spanish military engineers, who had spent months preparing these defenses, could only watch helplessly as years of work were undone in a matter of hours. Naval combat reports filed with the U.S. Navy Department, as documented in official correspondence held by the National Archives, revealed the systematic nature of American gunnery that morning, with over 5,000 rounds fired by Dewey's squadron. The political implications of the morning's work were immediately apparent to observers on both sides. Spain had lost not merely a fleet, but her entire capacity to defend her Pacific territories. The Philippines, Guam, and other Spanish possessions in the region now lay open to American occupation, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Pacific Ocean. The United States, previously regarded as a regional power confined to North American waters, had demonstrated its ability to project naval force across the globe. Filipino revolutionaries, who had been fighting Spanish colonial rule for years, watched the battle from shore with mixed emotions. While they celebrated the defeat of their Spanish oppressors, many wondered what American victory would mean for their own aspiration for independence. The morning's fighting had eliminated one colonial power, but it remained unclear whether it had simply replaced Spain with a new foreign master. Spanish survivors were treated with the courtesy traditionally accorded to brave enemies. In naval warfare, American medical personnel tended to Spanish wounded without distinction, and Spanish officers who had conducted themselves honorably were received aboard American vessels with professional respect. This adherence to the customs of civilized warfare stood in marked contrast to some of the brutal fighting that characterized land campaigns during the Spanish-American War. As the smoke cleared over Manila Bay, the full magnitude of what had transpired began to dawn on participants and observers alike. Commodore Dewey faced immediate practical challenges in the aftermath of his stunning victory. His squadron now controlled Manila Bay, but the city of Manila itself remained in Spanish hands, defended by substantial land forces that his ships could threaten but not capture without military support. The Commodore dispatched urgent messages to Washington requesting Army reinforcements to capitalize on his naval success, knowing that his victory would be incomplete until American forces could occupy the territories he had opened to conquest. The Spanish authorities in Manila found themselves in an impossible position. Their naval protection had been eliminated, their coastal fortifications destroyed, and their supply lines to Spain effectively severed. Governor-General Basilio Agustin Davila faced the choice between a hopeless defense that would only increase casualties among his garrison and civilian population, or negotiation with an enemy who now held all the strategic advantages. Filipino insurgent leader Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been conducting guerrilla warfare against Spanish rule, saw in the American victory both opportunity and uncertainty. The destruction of Spanish naval power offered the possibility of genuine independence for the Philippines, but American intentions remained unclear. Aguinaldo began cautious negotiations with American representatives, hoping to secure recognition for Filipino independence, while remaining wary of simply exchanging one colonial master for another. The international reaction to the Battle of Manila Bay was immediate and profound. European naval powers, who had dominated global maritime affairs for centuries, suddenly found themselves confronted with a new competitor whose naval capabilities had been dramatically underestimated. The precision and effectiveness of American gunnery, combined with the technological superiority of their vessels, forced a complete reassessment of global naval rankings. Spanish national pride suffered a crushing blow from which it would take decades to recover. The loss of the Pacific Squadron, following so closely upon previous naval disasters, represented more than military defeat. It symbolized the end of Spain's era as a great power. Spanish naval officers who survived the battle faced courts of inquiry and public recrimination, though most professional observers recognized that their defeat had been inevitable given the material disadvantage they faced. The American press celebrated Dewey's victory with enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. Newspapers across the United States proclaimed the dawn of American naval supremacy, and the Commodore became an instant national hero. His calm demeanor during the battle and his Humanitarian treatment of Spanish prisoners reinforced the image of American military professionalism that would become central to the nation's emerging imperial identity. Contemporary accounts in Harper's Weekly magazine documented the immediate global response to the battle, noting how European naval attaches scrambled to analyze American tactics and technology following news of the victory. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the Philippines themselves. Control of Manila Bay provided the United States with a naval base that could support operations throughout the Western Pacific, fundamentally altering the region's strategic geography. Japanese and other Asian powers began reassessing their own naval programs in light of demonstrated American capabilities, setting in motion competitive dynamics that would influence Pacific politics for decades to come. For the Spanish sailors who had fought so courageously that morning, the aftermath brought a mixture of professional respect from their enemies and criticism from their own countrymen who demanded explanations for such a complete defeat. Many would spend months as prisoners of war before eventual repatriation to Spain, where they faced a nation struggling to understand how its centuries-old empire had crumbled so quickly. The Battle of Manila Bay concluded with implications that would reverberate through the 20th century and beyond, transforming not only the immediate participants, but the entire structure of global power relationships. What had begun as a colonial skirmish between two unequal naval forces had evolved into a defining moment that marked America's emergence as a world power and Spain's final retreat from the stage of imperial competition. Commodore Dewey's victory established precedents for American naval operations that would influence military doctrine for generations. The battle demonstrated the decisive importance of technological superiority, professional training, and logistical support in modern naval warfare. American naval strategists would study the engagement's lessons carefully, incorporating its insights into the development of the Great White Fleet and subsequent naval expansion programs that would make the United States Navy the world's dominant maritime force. The human cost of the morning's fighting, while light by the standards of land warfare, represented individual tragedies that transcended national boundaries. Spanish families mourned sons and husbands who had died defending obsolete ships against overwhelming odds, while American families celebrated heroes who had achieved victory at remarkably little cost to themselves. These personal stories, multiplied across both nations, illustrated warfare's capacity to create simultaneous triumph and tragedy. Spanish naval reforms following the defeat at Manila Bay would focus on technological modernization and professional education, but these efforts came too late to restore Spain's position as a global maritime power. The nation's subsequent naval development would emphasize coastal defense rather than overseas projection, reflecting the new reality of Spain's reduced international status. The officers who survived Manila Bay would spend their remaining careers working to rebuild a navy whose imperial mission had ended forever. The Philippines themselves faced an uncertain future as American territorial acquisition replaced Spanish colonial administration. Filipino hopes for independence, briefly encouraged by Spanish defeat, would soon confront the reality of American imperial ambitions. The morning's naval battle had eliminated one foreign ruler only to install another, setting the stage for the Philippine-American War that would prove far more costly and controversial than the brief engagement that had made it possible. International law and naval tradition were both influenced by the conduct of operations at Manila Bay. Dewey's humanitarian treatment of Spanish prisoners and wounded established precedents for civilized warfare that would be referenced in subsequent conflicts. The battle's demonstration of modern naval capabilities also contributed to international efforts to regulate maritime warfare through treaties and conventions designed to limit civilian casualties and environmental damage. The technological lessons learned at Manila Bay accelerated naval development worldwide, as other powers sought to match American innovations in gunnery, armor, and ship design. The battle marked a transition point between the age of ironclad warships and the era of steel battleships that would dominate naval warfare until the advent of aircraft carriers decades later. Historical analysis published by the U.S. Naval Institute has consistently ranked the Battle of Manila Bay among the most strategically significant naval engagements of the modern era, comparing its impact to Trafalgar and Tsushima. For the United States, May 1, 1898, represented a moment of national transformation as profound as any in American history. A nation that had spent its first century focused primarily on continental expansion and internal development had demonstrated its capacity to project military power across vast, oceanic distances and defeat European opponents in their own colonial territories. The psychological impact of this achievement would influence American foreign policy decisions well into the 21st century. The Battle of Manila Bay thus stands as more than a military engagement. It represents a historical pivot point that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. In a few hours of combat on a distant bay, the old order of European imperial dominance gave way to new patterns of global power that would shape international relations for generations to come. The morning's fire had indeed forged a new world order, though its ultimate consequences would take decades to fully unfold.